Come on. There we go. Hi, Donald Davidoff, co-founder and CEO of Real Estate Business Analytics, here for yet another episode of The People Behind the Performance, where I sit down with key leaders and disruptors to dive into what's driving the real estate industry's success, the role data plays in it all, and tell the stories of the people behind it. I'm here today with Matt Slepin, who is founder and managing partner of Terra Search Partners, a retained executive search firm exclusive to the real estate industry. Terra Search's mission is to provide a highly consultative service, very focused with expertise and passion in the real estate business. Terra Search was recently acquired by ZRG. For those of you that don't know ZRG, they're a global talent advisory firm, and they're changing the way companies hire and manage talent. Their data-driven approach to executive and professional search has been changing the way clients think about how to find top talent. And of course, we at REBA love to hear about data-driven approaches. Before entering the field of executive search in 1998, Matt held leadership, management, and functional roles within the real estate industry for more than 20 years. Since 2017, he's been the host of a podcast series, Leading Voices in Real Estate, where he has conversations with leaders from throughout the real estate industry about their career journeys and the businesses that they run. And secretly, I'm very jealous of how good he is at that. Welcome, Matt. Glad to have you aboard.
Thank you.
So let's dive right in. As you think about the state of the industry today, what's on your mind?
Oh, well, first of all, we're talking about interest rate jumps, and we're talking about recession, and what does that mean, and what's it mean short term, and what's it mean long term, and of course, long term, you're going to ride right through it, so it'll be over, and we're not going to crash, and you're not going to come out the other end with no one living in apartments again. But the short-term pain is going to be tough, especially because we've had such a low interest rate environment for such a bizarrely long period of time. So that's going to be disruptive. Nevertheless, my feeling about this industry is really deep. I love the sector, and I think the fundamentals remain really strong. Supply is still out of whack, right? We still need a whole lot more housing, either ownership or rental housing. So those dynamics will keep driving this long term to places that we need to get to.
Excellent. Well, let's go into a little bit of your personal background now. So obviously you've been in the industry even a little bit longer than I have. So how did you get started out in this industry?
Well, first of all, if I'm on longer than you, that means I'm just like really old and stuff. But I fell into the business. I very quickly graduated college, moved to Washington, D.C. I got into public policy, and the policy work I did on Capitol Hill was as a lobbyist for low-income housing. Over time, I decided I didn't much like lobbying. I like low-income housing. That was interesting, but I really like housing, and I found the apartment industry a place that I wanted to start my career. And so I went from that into the apartment business. I joined what was then the largest owner of apartments, the National Housing Partnership, back in the syndication days, NHP, and I did seniors housing for them. And that kind of got me into this business over time. The thing I did prior to search, which will be relevant to your listeners, is I ran for 3 years a group called the Multifamily Housing Institute, which turned into a data effort coming out of the S&L crisis to find transparency in the multifamily business through the use of data, performance data, which no one had anything of. And I know that's music to your ears about what you guys think about. Yeah. So we'll come back to that one.
No, it is fascinating to me. I mean, your story sort of, it's analogous to mine and so many others. I refer to rental housing, particularly multifamily housing, as like the flypaper of industry verticals, right? You buzz around and somehow you get into it and then you're just stuck. You just never want to leave. So many people with that kind of story.
And let's talk about that for an instant, because it's something people don't think about, but I certainly do because I'm a recruiter. So I think about the human capital side of the business. And it's an industry within real estate that has a lot of affinities. And we do business together. There's a we to the apartment business, and it doesn't really exist in the other sectors of commercial real estate. But in the apartment business, we're all in this kind of game together. And we're going to keep playing it. We're not going to jump in and out and go do other kinds of transactions. So both from transactional people to operating people, this is word family is the wrong word, but it is certainly an industry in and of itself.
No, it is. And it's interesting because I grew up in the travel industry. And of course, the airlines, it was Bob Crandall against Stephen Wolf, right? American against United. It's Marriott against Hyatt against Hilton. So competitive. Car rental business even worse. And one of the things I love about our business, I mean, everything has its strengths and weaknesses, but we're such a fragmented business that, my sharing an idea doesn't mean you win and I lose the way it does, say, in a lot of the big travel companies. And I'm curious your perspective on that then, because I've always felt like that fragmentation opens up the possibility and the willingness to collaborate
Right.
more. I mean, heck, I was at Archstone. Did I really compete with Equity and with Camden? I mean, our stock prices went up and down the same. It was a rising tide to lift all boats, which is kind of how I got into the industry through pricing.
I was going to use that word precisely. The rising tide lifted all boats. The transformation of the industry from the time that
Hmm.
you got into it, from the S&L crisis and the modern REIT era to
Hmm.
today, the increasing institutionalization and sophistication of the business has been the theme of my career. Kind
Hmm.
of having watched that happen, benefited from that because it helps need better talent. So therefore, recruiters are more relevant to the business than in the cowboy era, which came before us.
Yeah, no, that's great, great observation. So when you look back on your career, who was your most influential professional mentor?
Mm. It's probably a guy named Peter Hall who actually started me in the recruiting business.
Hmm.
And so I made a pivot midway through my career. I left the Multifamily Housing Institute, moved to the West Coast because I was a trailing spouse. I was 40 years old. I had
Hmm.
just gotten on the cover of Real Estate Forum because of the Multifamily Housing Institute. I thought I'd achieved something big by being on the cover of a magazine, industry magazine.
Hmm.
But my wife had a job transfer and we moved the family to the West Coast. So I had a discontinuous change at age 40 in a
Wow.
career that was kind of DC centric.
Hmm.
And I met this guy who was a recruiter and he said, give it a try. And I snubbed my nose up at it and said, well, I'll do it half time and kind of give it a feel while I look for a real job.
Hmm.
But I immediately found in this niche of a niche that I was special and that I could distinguish myself and that I had something to offer. And so I actually found myself midway through my career in the place in the industry that was where I could thrive. And so he was the blessing of my career that way. A second one is my wife, Diane Olmsted, who through my career kept pushing me to find myself.
Hmm.
She believed I had something in there that really wasn't sure I had.
Oh, that's spectacular. So let's talk a little bit about that journey. I mean, since 2017, you've interviewed literally all the movers and shakers in the industry. It's really quite an impressive list of people. So I got a few questions around that. Who was your biggest get, and why were they such a good get?
Well, there's the biggest get and the hardest get. So first
Hmm.
of all, I spend almost as much time trying to, well, I spend more time in curation of the podcast. What do I want?
Hmm.
And in some ways, I'm trying to tell the industry's story.
Hmm.
So that's alongside the goal of diversity and different views of the industry sits alongside. I got to get this person. I got to get that person.
Hmm.
And so there's a couple of gets that are interesting. Sam Zell, of course, one of the biggest
I,
ones.
I was wondering whether you're going to bring up Sam. I figured that had to be quite a good get.
You have to.
Hmm.
And, luckily he was on a book tour. So through a
Ah.
mutual friend of ours, Alan George, I said, hey,
Hmm.
Alan, like, do you think maybe he'd want to do this? And he said, your timing's pretty good.
Sweet.
So that one worked well. And, these are other kind of big shots in the industry. But I got to interview a couple of weeks ago Stephen Ross in his office.
Yeah.
That was an important and really interesting one. Owen Thomas from the office business, who runs Boston
Yeah.
Properties. I,
Hmm.
I, I I'm Owen. I'm sorry to say this. I worked on him for 2.5 years,
Wow.
and it was a great interview and a very generous interview. And he's a great, generous leader in the real estate industry. So there's
Yeah.
just a lot of them. But some of the more interesting ones, I'm trying to get someone right now who's going to talk to me about bike paths, and
Hmm.
because I think that's an important story to tell. Plus, I have passion for that.
Uh-huh.
And what's the influence of bike lanes and bike paths and rental bikes in
Hmm.
different cities where that's become a way of life where 10 years ago it
Interesting.
didn't exist. Anyhow,
Yeah.
I'm going to get someone for that.
Cool. Cool. What's the most interesting thing you've learned from your interviews?
Um, I learned many things. So I've never had a bigger education myself than
Hmm.
getting the opportunity to do these podcasts. So, and having now done 120 of them, and every one has its own surprise.
Hmm.
One thing, um, everyone's a nice person, but they're not really in work, but they certainly describe themselves as such. So there's a
Right.
couple people in there that go, "Come on, you're not really saying that." Um, but a whole bunch of the people who I've most admired came into a business that they created with really highfalutin goals of creating culture first. You
Hmm.
know, and the interview with Camden, Keith Oden is the one that comes to
Yeah.
mind first, where they started, they put a napkin together, and on the napkin, they say, "Hey, we just want to be a great company. We don't want to
Right.
be, it wasn't the goal of biggest, it wasn't the goal of becoming a millionaire or whatever.
Hmm.
It was the goal of a great company, and they knew that culture was going to define them. And there were more people that I talked to who had that goal in
Hmm.
starting a business than you'd imagine, because I grew up believing people started businesses because they
Yeah.
want to get wealthy. And
Yeah.
I was wrong. That's right, right? That comes alongside it.
Right.
And so we really try to explore those dynamics in the podcast. And I love hearing those stories, and they're
Yeah.
for real.
That's fascinating. I recall listening to the Bob DeWitt interview you did just a little bit ago. Really, again, somebody who's really culture oriented. And of course, I mean, a lot of people don't know this. I actually did my master's thesis on organizational culture. And so it's always been a passion subject for me. And the blessing to work for Scott Sellers and the crew at Archstone.
Right.
One of the stories they told me is when they sat down on a retreat to figure out their core values, the question they asked themselves was, if we were all here to run a business that wasn't apartments, it was completely different than apartments, what are the things that we would still hold dear, because they're independent of the business that you're in, and sort of culture emanated from those fundamental values you hold dear, independent of the business vertical you're in.
Well, and that's really what's happened in the apartment business. We alluded to this before, but companies like Archstone and EQR and Avalon and
Hmm.
Camden, they leapfrogged what the business used to have been.
Hmm.
And it used to be the cowboys, it used to be a collection of assets, and it moved into becoming operating companies that were permanent.
Hmm.
And once you have that mental shift to that we're creating a permanent company, then there's a different dynamic to what it is you're trying to create. There's a different role of investment in technology and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But it was a different perspective that had never happened in the real estate business.
Yeah, no, it's been wild. I came in just at the end of the start of that, like late
Yeah.
'98, early '99, and watching the evolution of the last 23 years has been amazing. So maybe what's maybe the funniest or strangest moment that's happened for you across 120 interviews that at least you're
Um,
willing to share?
yeah, I guess the first one might be an easy one. I interviewed the mayor of Oakland,
Hmm.
and it was my first podcast. I was in her office. I'd never been in a mayor's office. It was dark. It was kind of weird.
Hmm.
And you're all wondering who listened to my podcast, where's that episode? Well, I hit record on the computer, but I didn't hit record on my new microphone. So I
Oh
spent an
no.
hour and a half with the mayor of Oakland. My first podcast, got back to the office, gave my assistant my computer, said, please download this. Let's get it loaded up. There was nothing there.
Oh God.
So it was going to be like a stillbirth of a podcast career. I was so embarrassed. We didn't get to do it again, but that was pretty embarrassing. Maybe Gerald Hines, like about 5 minutes into it, his nose started bleeding, and this was some months before he died.
Uh-huh.
So but it's just a privilege to be in the
Yeah.
room with him and talk to him and just hear the stories, which are hard to get out.
Hmm.
But every single one comes with a great story,
Yeah. No,
tell you
that
the
that
truth.
that is truly amazing. I will
And
say
and one
you've.
other comment to that. I'm sorry to
Mhm. No, no,
interrupt
go
you, but
ahead, please.
if you do the contrast between, 1 week I'm with a woman who's the head YIMBY in the country in her living room. If
Hmm.
you've ever been in a living room of a head YIMBY, a millennial YIMBY, like what does that mean? And then a couple months later I'm in the office with Stephen Ross.
Yeah.
And what a contrast, but each of these people have amazing things to tell us.
Yeah.
And I don't judge between them, and our listeners shouldn't either, because each of them are bring kind of jaw-dropping aha moments.
Yeah, no, that is quite the journey across that. In fact, you've touched on my biggest fear. This being my, I think, fifth or sixth podcast, is I'm always terrified that I forget to hit record, and then 35 minutes later you have a wonderful conversation and no artifact to share with anyone. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, let's turn a little bit then to kind of your more recent activities. I mean, obviously in the tech world, folks like me, I mean, as CEO of a tech startup, I pay a lot of attention to mergers and acquisitions. It's not as often that service firms are acquired. So tell us a little bit about that journey to the acquisition by ZRG.
Yeah. So mergers and acquisitions are hard in a service firm. We have a very, very low multiple in
Mhm.
our work, and our work walks out the door every night.
Yeah.
So it really is less. You just can't create the value in a very small business platform. It's not real based on the person itself,
Hmm.
themselves. And what's interesting is ZRG is a platform. So platform versus boutique. Boutique is wonderful. It's delightful work. We get
Hmm.
to lean in to do the things that we love to do. And it has no multiple. It has no value. If I decide not to come to work tomorrow, we're done.
Right.
A company like ZRG or any of the big either consulting firms or search firms have name brand recognition. They have a platform, they have a business platform. And if any one person doesn't show up tomorrow, it doesn't really matter to the company.
Hmm.
And so that does come with a multiple from a business standpoint. So they're
Yep.
able to acquire companies like
Right.
us and then, you know,
Yeah.
make that work from an economic standpoint. So it's a wonderful thing. And the other thing is, at a certain point of time, not having a back office platform is really limiting to the kinds of work that you could do.
Yeah.
And so that happened to us at Terra Search Partners, and we weren't able to offer, the kind of internal succession planning that we wanted. When we have 11 people, we had 3 pregnancies in 2 years.
Hmm.
That's a big disruption to a group of 11 people. I love pregnancies. I love the babies that came to the company,
Right.
but that's a lumpy way to have to do the business that you do, and you just can't afford to do that in a tiny company.
Cool. So what, I mean, based on that experience, what advice would you give any other founders as they navigate their corporate trajectory?
Yeah. Well, my sense, first of all, it's founders of a small personal, consulting business is really
Hmm.
different than the founder of an apartment company, right? We're going to create a value add platform. And
Hmm.
so that pathway is monetizable. My pathway is not particularly monetizable. And
Hmm.
so you can grow your platform to a certain point, and then you have decisions along the way, which happens with all of our clients along that life cycle. Let's think of this as an
Hmm.
apartment company, not a search firm. And so, the questions become what places, what do you want to achieve at different plateaus of growth?
Hmm.
And you get to 5,000 units. What's that mean? And where can you go with that? And what kind of capital can you bring? What kind of
Yeah.
team can you have? What kind of sharing can you do internally? What kind of
Hmm.
platform can you have on the management side? And so those questions at 5,000 units, 20,000 units, 50,000
Yeah.
units, whatever it is, they become really different. And they also become different at the decades of age of the leadership team.
Hmm.
And sometimes there's internal succession. Sometimes internal succession works, but they don't work from a capital standpoint because the founders made a lot of dough. They use their balance sheet in order to do new transactions. And then the
Hmm.
succeeding generation can't afford to do that. So they have to bring in a partner.
Hmm.
Well, a capital partner is succession, whether it's the same team or not,
Fair
whether
point.
it's a sale or a capital partner, all of these things are mushed up together.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. It's a big
I'm
part of our
curious.
business.
Yeah, when you were mentioning how a company grows, I'm curious if this resonates with you. I'd always observed what I kind of referred to as the power of two, where like a 2,000 unit company is a small mom and pop. When you get to four, it starts to be a different business in kind, not just degree. Now you start to need some systems. At eight, that's even more true. By the time you get to 16, all of a sudden you don't know everybody the way you knew everything. At 32, you're in a different
Right.
category, and then kind of into the 60 plus, now you're in that sort of NMHC top, 10 or 20. And it really does feel like, I mean, maybe the 2 to 4 is a bit of a stretch, but from 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32,
Yeah.
and 32 to 64 plus, it really feels like you have to reinvent the business because the communication channels have changed. Just so many different things. It's not just a change in degree; it truly is a change in kind. Does that resonate with you, or what's kind of your experience as you've advised companies through their growth?
Yeah, I don't know the power of two precisely. So
Hmm.
that one's new to me, just as a metaphor to use for this.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely talking my language in terms of how do you help a company think about its place in the industry
Hmm.
at the place that it is.
Yep.
And what's its growth look like? What's its capital look like? What's its portfolio look like? What's its efficiencies look like?
Hmm.
From an operation standpoint, which is one of the things that, is in your world, um, I think that technology and increasing sophistication trickles down in the industry. And I think it's democratized by technology because
Yeah.
everyone can now access stuff, even in a suite of things, right?
Hmm.
A suite of services that they couldn't have 10 years ago.
Yeah. That's
And
certainly part of what Reba's
it's a
trying
big
to
deal.
do on the data side. Yeah. So hey, here's one of my favorite questions. I ask this one of everybody we interview. What is one thing that you know about the industry today that you wish you could go back and teach 1998 Matt Slepin when he started, this game, that in those first few years you didn't really know that you know now? What's one thing
Mm.
you wish you could teach 1998 Matt Slepin?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I used to use this about dating. So what would the young Matt Slepin who was dating wanted to have known?
Yes.
And and this is just personal to me. So it's not about the industry. It's that things would have worked out okay
Hmm.
because I was so busy forcing things to work out okay and
Hmm.
feeling that they weren't going to work out okay that I didn't have as much fun either in
Hmm.
dating or in the early part of my career. I came to it from some level of insecurity.
Hmm.
And once the insecurity started dissipating, because I proved myself in various ways in my career, then it
Yeah.
became really delightful. I could become masterful at things. But I found for me as a human being that my
Hmm.
30s and 40s were challenging in that regard, or my 20s and 30s were really challenging in that regard. And then
Yeah.
it started getting more delightful. Second thing that would be interesting is if you know that you're going to be in a space and that you're going to remain in that space. What back to our comment about the apartment industry or whatever sector or whatever
Hmm.
discipline you have, if you know that you're committing your career to that place, then you execute it in a different way. And one thing that's lucky for me is that my gut sense is that relationships are long term. So I like relationships. Know that you're going to be in this industry a long time and you
Yeah.
can't mess up things in your sector. Don't mess up with people. Be honest, be direct.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
long game in terms of relationships, in terms of skill building. And that's really important lesson.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me. I've always, in my 20 plus years now in this industry, I've always pointed out to anybody I work with or who's asking me for career advice that this is a remarkably small industry. There's a lot of zeros because of the capital, but it's actually a remarkably small industry. And whatever you do, don't burn a bridge because there aren't that many bridges in the industry. There really aren't.
And a couple burned bridges like are known by others. You can look across the
Hmm.
horizon and go, whoa, there's a couple burned bridges behind that person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's not worth
Exactly.
doing.
Hey, so quick shift before we talk a little bit about what's near and dear to my heart on data. But I know, I mean, in learning a little bit about you to prep for this, I actually learned that you have a passion about food recovery. So tell the audience a little bit about how you got involved with Extra Food, and if there's any other charitable work that you'd like to share. I know that's important to you.
Yeah, thank you. So my best friend, a guy named Marvin Zouderer in Marin County, California, and we go cycling every other weekend. And I'm remembering cycling around the Nicasio Lake for Reservoir, if anyone knows what that is. But anyhow, he was telling me about this business that he was trying to start, which was a nonprofit. And it was a nonprofit to say that we live in the county of Marin. I no longer live there, but one of the wealthiest counties in the country. But we found that 20% of people are food insecure in the wealthiest county in the country. And we have an abundance of farms and cows and all kinds of stuff in the county. So it just doesn't make sense. And so in our county, we thought there would be a way to share food, particularly that's going otherwise into the landfill. So there's an
Hmm.
environmental aspect to it and a social justice aspect about hunger.
Hmm.
That maybe if we stood in the middle of that, we'd be able to get food diverted from landfill and get it into people's stomachs. And that's what we did through the nonprofit sector in Marin County. So it's an amazing organization that is replicated. There's elsewhere in the country. It's not the food bank that gets trucks of
Hmm.
beans and things from big grocery stores, but we have volunteers who pick up at restaurants and farmers markets, caterers. We just get extra food diverted from landfill, get it to a nonprofit, brings it right to a food pantry, and gets it to people who really need that.
Wow, that's spectacular. That's a really good story to hear. So let's switch a little bit. I personally perceive that rental housing companies have evolved in the criteria that they look for in leaders. You've obviously had a front row seat to that for almost 25 years now. What have you seen change in what companies are looking for, and maybe just as importantly, what are sort of the bedrock things that have stayed the same?
Yeah. So I think one of the headlines for me in this business, and I've alluded to this earlier in the conversation, is that this business was really all about transactions in the early days before the
Hmm.
revolution that we've already alluded to. And that changed to become a business about business platform. Archstone, EQR, Camden, Blackstone,
Hmm.
LiveCore for Blackstone, whatever it is,
Right.
they're nothing if not a business platform.
Yeah.
And the next deal doesn't actually move the needle. And so one of the things that I've noticed at the beginning of this is the founder of most of these companies
Hmm.
came from the transaction side. They were big deal guys or gals, but it was all guys. So they were big deal guys when they started this. But the people who are leading these companies now are broad-based leaders.
Hmm.
They're MBAs who know what a business platform looks like, and they're able to put equal focus on transactions, capital structure,
Hmm.
operations, technology, culture, human capital, and that skill to look broadly across a business and grow it all together and make it great all together and make profits all together is what we need in this industry.
Yeah. It's interesting. I wasn't thinking about diversity, but you mentioned, back then it was so many, I mean, it was all guys, right? It was all deal guys.
All guys.
And
Yeah.
I'm curious again, you being involved with executive recruiting for so long, um, you know, sort of how do you prognosticate how that will continue to get better in the future? Because I think today, and I think of Sue Ansell at Gables, I think of, Lori Baker and Christy Simonette at Camden. We've mentioned Camden before.
Yep.
They're Julie Smith at Bizzuto and now Stephanie Williams, of course. So, I remember my first NAREIT meeting in like 99 or 2000. And yeah, it was a middle-aged white male fest. And I remember, working at Archstone with Dana Hamilton, who at the time was, I think, the highest ranking female
Yeah.
executive. And then you fast forward to today, and I shouldn't leave Dana out, right? She's a partner at Pretium on the single family
Yeah.
side. So, I mean, what do you attribute some of that movement to? And I'm sure it probably hasn't even moved as much as it should. So what's going to take to keep moving that forward and getting the sort of equity and inclusion that I think the industry needs?
Yeah. Um, so it's one of our biggest challenges, although I'm an optimist towards what we've already accomplished. And you just said it, right?
Mhm.
So you just went through a list of names of people who were leaders. And I think the apartment business probably a bit ahead of the other sectors of commercial real estate. So I think of the entire real estate universe, not just apartments in my business,
Mhm.
but in the apartment sector, I think more friendly, more opportunity to see these examples of people. Marianne King, I'm thinking of the
Yeah.
former heads of NMHC, right? The chair people of
Yep.
NMHC have really
Yep.
moved that needle. I think of diversity in terms of gender. I think of diversity in terms of racial, obviously, as well, which is
Mhm.
our next hurdle and a really,
Yeah.
really big challenge, obviously. Um, I also think of it in terms of perspective. I have a client who
Mhm.
just asked me on an RFP, like, okay, how do you deal with diversity? And my first question was, diversity might mean just different perspectives to begin with, not just
Mhm.
all Harvard MBA perspectives of
Yeah.
white guys.
Right.
And so, and who understands our tenants? Who understands our capital base? And
Mhm.
who brings those perspectives? And it's the whole C suite not just the CEO that matters to those points.
Yeah.
So there's various entry points that will move that needle. And it's also the perspective of young people. Um, Sometimes older folks don't quite understand technology very well. They don't understand uh, the Facebook or whatever that. Not
Yeah.
right. They understand Facebook, but they don't understand Instagram.
Yeah.
And these are places that we're marketing now, and people are going to
Yeah.
buy entirely online.
Oh yeah.
And and if someone hasn't had the experience of renting a whole ton of Airbnbs, so I've
Hmm.
done Airbnb enough to kind of have some sense of what young renters might be using.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I have a 27 and a 23-year-old daughter, and they've been my my go-to focus group for that sort of stuff. In fact, I was just with my younger daughter the other day, and she's an equity resident. She's in equities property in Glendale, California, and I mean, she has a Facebook account. I don't know that she's been on it in the last 6 months. I mean, it's all Instagram, and she's the first one to admit, like, well, I'm 23. I'm probably old now. Like, I haven't really gotten to
Right.
TikTok, which is what the next wave is. So, yeah, that age diversity is definitely as important for getting good ideas as anything
Yeah.
else.
And if you go to a ULI meeting or you go to a
Hmm.
ULI Young Leaders meeting,
Hmm.
there are equal number of women, I think,
Yeah,
close to an equal number of women, and there are people of all
yeah.
backgrounds in that room.
Well, yeah, no, and I'm with you. I mean, not that we're done, but we've certainly made tremendous progress on the gender equity. I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is
Yeah.
actually I think it's still the wealthiest majority Black county in the
Hmm.
nation. And if there's one thing that I've noticed, especially having been in Atlanta with kids where it was very racially diverse, is yeah, I think the next frontier is, how do we get more racial diversity at the top, right? I mean, it's great to have a Daryl Carter, it's great to have some, but I guess the silver lining I see is I feel like when I'm at conferences that skew a little towards the younger, I start to see a little more of that, and maybe that's a hope for the future. But I don't know. I just personally think the racial boundaries seem to be a little harder than the gender boundaries to crack.
Yeah, and also the younger generation has different. I use the word prejudice carefully, but they have
Hmm.
different experiences with
Yeah,
diversity, and that
yeah,
might be their best friend may be gay, their best friend might be trans, and
mhm,
they don't think about it as
yeah,
something that they have a hurdle, right? It may be a
yeah,
person different color, they marry a person that way. Look,
yeah,
we're Jewish people here, and
yep,
I grew up with the biggest, both the most liberal view of the world, but
hmm,
also, boy, you better marry a Jewish person kind of thing.
hmm,
And that kind of diversity is really changing in the world.
yeah,
Those aren't the issues. You want someone who's wonderful and great and lovely
yeah.
in your family, then you've dodged the
No,
bullets.
totally get that. Totally get that. Well, let's come into the home stretch. We always like to finish our interviews having done the heavy lifting. We want to have a little bit of fun, sort of rapid fire kind of James Lipton style Q&A. So the only rule is don't think too hard. Okay. So we'll wrap it up with seven. I think it's seven quick questions. Number one, what book has influenced you the most?
Color of Law. And
Cool.
it's a real estate book. Everyone should read it.
Excellent. What's your favorite time of day?
I like first thing in the morning. I love that coffee between 6 and 6:45. Coffee.
Perfect. What's your favorite app?
My favorite app. Oh, Strava. I'm a cyclist, and
Mhm.
either Strava or Zwift. Everyone
Okay.
should check it out.
Great. What's your personal pet peeve?
Bad breath.
Um, here's one that gets a little mystical, but what the heck? We'll have some fun with it. What's your spirit animal?
Ooh. It's probably my dog, mostly because my dog has the softest ears in the world, so I could be a dog.
Go with your dog. Great. If you had to pick one food to eat forever, what would you eat?
Sushi.
Sushi. There we go. And what's your good go-to for having a great laugh?
um, I'm not a good laugher, so I have to think about this. Um, I now you've finally stumped me here. So
Fair enough.
I can't answer that question.
We'll let it go. If nothing else, I got a good laugh from the question. So maybe having somebody ask you an off-center question is a way to get a good laugh. Well, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us, Matt. Where can everyone find out a little bit more about you and Terra Search Partners slash ZRG?
Yeah, so probably three places. One is the Terra Search Partners.com website. On that website, if you go to terrasearchpartners.com/voices, you can get to the podcast. And the best way to
Okay.
learn about me is just to listen to a couple of these, because you'll hear me and you know me in your earbuds. And then also via ZRGpartners.com.
Excellent. So, hey, one final question. You're the king of industry interviewers, so I got to ask you, given Reba's bent towards data analytics, who would you recommend we interview next?
Oh, for data analytics, David Stanford.
He was it's funny you say that. He was our very first webcast. He was the very first person we had on this. So great minds think alike. Thank you so much, Matt. This was such a joy to spend some time with you. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.
Mhm.